I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, I mentioned the red mittens from the Vancouver Olympics from 2010. There's of course, the iconic striped blanket, and I think there will be people who will people who know their history. Maybe they'll go straight to the 1700s and think of lots of examples of how the Bay influenced this country. But the point is, none of the memories that we're all thinking of when we say the words the Bay are recent. Right now, the future of the Bay is looking a little bit grim. The company is looking to liquidate all of its retail operations. So let me tell you why this is a big deal. The Hudson Bay Company was founded centuries before Canada itself was created. It was instrumental in the project of building the country in ways that were also incredibly detrimental to Indigenous people. However, since 1670, this is a company that has been one of the most powerful symbols of Canada. It's a brand that has worked really hard to specifically wrap itself in the flag and kind of become a cultural ambassador, a part of this cultural identity. And today we're going to talk about that place, the place that the Bay occupies in Canadian culture. Even though it is technically owned by Americans and it maybe feels a little bit like a metaphor that is collapsing right at this moment. Mark Harrison is here, Mosha, Lundström, Halbert is here, and Teri, Hart is here, and they are all ready to get into this. It's really nice to have you all on the show. How's it going, everybody?
Hi, friends.
Hello. This is what a delight. I got to say, Moshe and Mark, both of you worked at the Bay. So this is going to be, I'm excited to hear from your experiences. Moshe, I'm going to start with you. You were an associate fashion director for the Hudson Bay Company back in 2012. So you had a bit of a front row seat at the Bay. What went wrong? What do you think went wrong?
Yes, well, I remember my first day on the job, which was actually in New York, because it was at the time when Hudson's Bay had acquired Lord and Taylor. And we've gone on to see them acquire Saks and Neiman Marcus now and Bergdorf Goodman. But Elamin, I have to say, I need to be honest on this. My very first day on the job, I had a hit in my stomach. I just felt like this was not a sustainable business model anymore. And that was more than 10 years ago. The first day and the first week, I began looking for other employment because I just didn't see a future in this retail model. I didn't feel that the leadership in place had the vision that was needed in order to turn such a massive and complicated ship around. And for me, it was just the writing was all over the wall even then.
The idea of walking into a job on the first day and saying, "Oh, I should get back on the job boards because this is not the place to be." That also feels like a metaphor. That feels like like the writing's been on the wall for some time. Mark, you work in marketing and branding. The Bay was your biggest client for a long time, for 20 years until 2006, which is a way of saying everything that happened afterwards. That's not on me, pal. That wasn't my fault. Leave me out of it. Mark, listen. Does it surprise you? Does it surprise you that we've come to this point where the Bay is maybe close to closing all of its retail operations?
Well, I think to Moshe's point, I think the writing for me was on the Skillet restaurant menu. It was, and thankfully you're old enough to know what I mean.
Yep.
My very first meeting was out at a Zeller's logistics outlet in Mississauga. And I remember being led into the basement. And I just, there was a metaphor for that. It was like the meeting room's underground. I'm not sure that there was some, it's one of those organizations. Individually, there was lots of great, smart, talented people, but you kind of had this feeling that we were underground, literally beating our heads against the wall, and decisions that were coming down just didn't make a lot of sense. That being said, the Bay, Zellers, those brands were institutions in our country. So I was, one of those people who thought, well, this got to work. It's been here forever. But yeah, it was an odd group to get started with.
I think there's this thing we do, Teri, where we assume that institutions that have been around for a long time will just continue to be around for a long time. And every once in a while, we're presented with these moments where we say, oh, actually, the fundamentals have kind of been under threat for a while. The way we think about this thing has been under threat for some time. And then suddenly, something that has been around for a really long time ceases to exist. How do you think about the idea of something as iconic as the Bay ceasing to exist, Teri?
Well, there was no writing on any wall for me. I was there like 2 weeks ago. I was a faithful.
Yeah.
And I actually do feel pretty emotional about this. I
Yeah.
mean, in Canada, this is the last standing mall department store. So Eaton's is gone, Sears is gone. And if you were a suburban kid or a kid from like outside of the suburbs, even like I was Brantford, Ontario, and then Brampton, Ontario, and the mall was my life. Like that is where I worked, that's where I hung out. And these stores were literally the tent poles of these malls.
The anchor stores, that's what they called them, right? Like the idea, like the whole mall operates around this one store.
Yeah, Eaton's was at one end, Sears was at the other end, and the Bay made that kind of triangle that many malls were created with that kind of look.
Yeah.
So, and then as an adult, I shopped at the Bay on the regular because it was easy for me. I liked Bay Days a lot. I was that person that forwarded the Bay Day email to friends because those sales were good. I looked forward to Bay Days in October and I could, get a head start on my Christmas shopping. I was really upset that my Bay points are gone because I was hoarding them.
Yep.
I mean, there's a lot, I feel very personal about this. So I do think it's kind of a cultural touchstone that is at the risk, the very real risk of going away. And it's kind of a lifestyle change. And I think that what Mosha and Mark are indicating is that from a corporate standpoint and a business standpoint, maybe the writing has been on the wall for that lifestyle change to happen for a while now.
I think the idea of maybe losing this company, there's the gravity of it sort of registers in waves. Like the idea of, okay, it was this gigantic, iconic company, and now people's relationships with those spaces have changed. You were at the Bay 2 weeks ago, Teri. I'm not sure a lot of people are still shopping at malls, right? That relationship itself has changed. And so there's something to be said about how it's at the precipice of a lot of different social changes. And also, we should say, we talk about the mall as sort of like a symbol of a time gone by. We're talking about 9,000 jobs on the line here. Like there's a lot of people who put their livelihood into a company like the Bay. That's a gigantic number of jobs. Mosha, your mom, Linda Lundström, founded an outerwear company in the 1970s. It made its clothes in Canada, sold them at stores like the Bay. I'm curious, when you think about the potential loss of a space like the Bay, what does that mean for Canadian fashion designers?
Well, I know people who have lost their jobs at the Bay currently. I know fashion designers and vendors that are affected by this. And having grown up in the industry, I'm actually third generation in fashion because on my dad's side, they were furriers on Spadina. I've seen the effects that losing a big account like the Bay was for many vendors can have. I mean, when my mother had struggles with her business, which was due to the recession triggered by September 11th, and a bunch of stores canceled their orders with her, that put my family's livelihood in harm's way. Like, we're literally talking about us being able to keep our house. And I know for a lot of brands that I've spoken with, this is how serious it is for them. They're completely put out in harm's way because the Bay owes them a ton of money. Also, Saks owes their vendors a ton of money as well. And then you have all these people that have lost their jobs that are so hardworking. I mean, I think our favorite part of going to a department store is actually having a conversation in real life with a real person.
Yeah.
And I think it's really sad on a lot of fronts, but I also think that a lot of very irresponsible financial and real estate maneuvers by the billionaire owner of Hudson's Bay, Richard Baker, who's quite cavalier about the whole thing, is going to be just fine himself, is what got us here.
If folks are just joining us, my name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and we are talking about the demise and the collapse of the Bay, which appears to be at the precipice of liquidating all of its stores. Mosha, I want to shift from talking about the Bay as a retailer to talking about this sort of larger idea of the Bay as a brand and as an image. Just over a decade ago, Proper Assouline, this French publisher of coffee table books, created a book about the Bay, and I want to read you a quote. He said, "The thrill for me was was to come to Canada and discover something completely new for me. The Bay is not a store, it's a country. How does that sentence land for you think?
Well, everyone in Canada has some kind of affiliation and relationship with the Bay, but not everyone has been continuing that relationship on an ongoing, regular basis. And I just don't think that the Bay has been, or Hudson's Bay, as they want us to call it, has been able to really meet the moment of the modern consumer. I just think the stores are way too big. And the consumer experience became less and less of an exciting proposition beyond getting a bargain. And I think it was sort of like a race to the bottom. I don't think that the special history of Hudson's Bay was being honored.
I think there's something about a company, Mark, that tries to sort of weave itself into a national identity, where something hits different when it gets sold to an American buyer, which is what happened in 2006. Yet it still felt, and I think continues to feel for a lot of people, as kind of quintessentially Canadian. How do you think it's managed to do that?
Well, a couple of things. And Mosha hit the nail on the head about the current ownership, who's never thought of it as retail. They think of it as real estate. But people forget that the first American owner, Jerry Zucker, was actually quite very supportive of the Bay and Hudson's Bay. And unfortunately, he died quite quickly after buying the company. But I'll tell you two stories, and I'll get to the Olympic mittens in a second. But one of the things about retail and business in general is one of my mentors always said, a great franchise store will always outperform a great corporate store, meaning the person that owns the franchise, the Tim Hortons or the Home Hardware, that lives in the town, that gets to know everybody, will outperform. But one of the interesting things about the Bay, and I was working on this sort of massive national store ideation project to figure out how we can be more community oriented. We found out that the fountains in the Bay stores were actually in the malls, were actually one of the biggest fundraisers in the community. People would come in and there'd be a charity up there for a month, and you'd flip coins, don't ask me what a coin is, into them. And so that became one of the things where we made sure that every Bay store across the country had at least a month or two in the local mall where we actually worked with community partners to fundraise. The big thing is people think about numerous things they did. The blankets are obvious, the colors of the blankets, what they stood for, their art collection. But the Olympic mittens hits home personally for me. I'm fortunate enough to have gone to many Olympics. And I was in Paris last summer and saw HBC Olympic mittens from the 2010 Vancouver and Whistler Olympics and Paralympics. And that was an interesting idea. And a little bit of a secret is that there was actually somebody at VANOC who invented those mittens. And HBC had been looking for an activation around the Olympics. And when they showed them the HBC, they actually said, you can't tell anybody you came up with this idea. We did. And, the rest is history. Right. So I'm not going to bust the person, because if he's listening, he's like, oh my gosh, I'm on 14 years of probation or 15. But those mittens, that sort of icon, and obviously the blankets go with it sitting, but those, you got to understand, in the Olympic world, those mittens are in every country in the world because of 2010.
I gotta say,
what else can you think that did that?
Mark is breaking news on the show. That's what I like.
People busted.
That's what I like about this. Mosha, I'm going to come back to you on the blankets in just a moment, but Teri, I just want to get your reaction because we've talked about other department stores. Very few of them have managed to weave their way into the national identity the same way that the Bay has. It even continued to do so after being sold to an American buyer in 2006. So, we don't talk about like Woodward's in the same way. How do you think the Bay managed to do that?
I mean, I think that we're doing a lot of talking right now about what is Canadian and what does being Canadian mean. Yeah. Made in Canada versus produced in Canada. We all know the difference now of that at the grocery store. And I think that the Bay is a brand that will always feel Canadian. Like I liken it to, a Celine Dion or a Ryan Gosling or even Rush. Like no matter how big they get elsewhere in the world or what else they're carrying in their store, in this case, they'll always be ours. And, Mark brings up those Olympic mitts from 2010 from the Vancouver Olympics. And, I was thinking if I was to dress like the quintessential Canadian, those mittens would be on that person. Maybe we'd have, a Canadian tuxedo, denim on top, denim on bottom, a little like, Muskoka dinner jacket, a toque, and the mittens. I mean, it's just so Canadian. So I think that most recently, the Bay, in some weird way, they were kind of embracing that Canadianness in a way that I wasn't seeing from other big department stores, big brands. Like they liked being Canadian, even though they weren't, and they haven't been since 2006. They embraced that Canadianness. And, I think that being Canadian was part of the Bay, just as the Bay is a part of Canada, including all of that problematic history.
Okay, I want to get to that problematic history because we've talked about this idea of the Bay as a retailer and the idea of the Bay as a place that can support Canadian fashion designers. And we talked about the idea of the Bay as a brand that has sort of, stayed close to the identity of Canada all throughout these years. But there's a much deeper history here. And I want to take a moment and listen to the Anishinaabe writer Niigaan Sinclair, who was on The Current this week.
There's no tears lost for the end of the Bay. The Hudson Bay Company started with profits from slavery. Prince Rupert used funds from the profits of slaves to come and build a fur trade economy that exploited Indigenous peoples, that took money from the local economy. Continues when it wasn't able to make enough profit and exploit people, whether it was back in the day when they refused to let Indigenous families marry into fur traders' lives, or letting Indigenous peoples trade anywhere but the forts, or even operating forcibly in English. The Hudson Bay Company has always been a company that hasn't always been friendly to the communities in which it works in, and there's really not a lot of love lost.
Mosha, what Niigaan's talking there is like this idea that the Bay is not just symbolically linked to this country's foundation. It is quite in practice linked. Like listening to Niigaan talking there, what comes up for you as you sort of think about this?
I mean, I completely support his sentiment. And personally, I would not have a Hudson's Bay blanket in my home. I don't. What it symbolizes doesn't align with my values.
Do you want to talk about the symbol and what that means? Because I think maybe there are different interpretations of the meaning of that blanket.
Well, really, it was originally like a Scottish blanket that was given to Indigenous people in exchange for fur and land. And it really wasn't a fair trade. Like, to me, it represents colonial power. I don't think it represents Canadian pride. I know it's very recognizable, but for me, it feels very fraught. And I would want to respect the wishes of Indigenous people who feel that it is something that is really offensive. And I understand that. And I think it's okay to revisit and unpack these like tropes that have been in our culture for eons and that are associated with like cottage culture and being cozy and Canadian and having your cup of coffee, and just dismantling it and being like, you know what? It's really not all that great. Let's find new symbols that we can get behind.
I'm sensitive to that idea, the idea that it's a recognizable brand, and so therefore that's the reason that so many people would sort of rally around the symbol and go like, well, we don't have a lot of recognizable symbols that we can all identify and say, oh, this is a part of the history of this country. But when you lay it out that simply, you say, how could you possibly have that blanket and not feel at all any kind of complication about it? Its origin points, what it was used for, and I have to say, Teri, to me, this speaks to this moment also, right? Like that this moment of, we're in a moment where we're trying to reconsider and reconfigure what it means to be Canadian right now. And to have a symbol like the Bay, A, become an American company, and then B, potentially collapse. It is an invitation, I say, to sort of like kind of reconfigure the current symbols that we look to, that say like, this is the thing that I look to that reminds me of Canada. Having said that, is it ironic to you that this is the moment when there's never been more demand for Canadian products and Canadian brands, and you get this recognizable symbol, this recognizable brand collapsing right as people are like, okay, what is the thing that I can do, to literally wrap myself in the flag?
I mean, one could look at this cynically, which isn't usually how I look at things.
I was going to say, that's not you, Teri.
One could look at this cynically and say, like, is it possible that the American owners are trying to capitalize on this buy Canadian and patriotic moment, thinking that maybe this really unique time is going to bring somebody to the table for them to get the money that they need to keep the doors of the Bay open. I mean, are we being manipulated in our own patriotic moment? The other thing is I don't think of the Bay as the place to buy Canadian brands. In fact, I think that the brand of the Bay is Canadiana, but that's a very different thing than buying Canadian. And that is not what the Bay represents. In fact, like there were times in my life when I kind of celebrated them bringing in American brands that weren't available. And there's a real contradiction there, right? Like the brand being Canadiana, but them not carrying Canadian brands. So I think that there's no doubt that if we do lose this brand, that it's represented a lot of Canadian history, good and bad and all of that. And to Mosha's point, that Canadian lifestyle, that cozy, that cottagey, that, we're with you when you pour that cup of coffee in the morning before you put your fire on. I mean, it's there's a real strange thing at this time that, as you said, Elamin, we are experiencing nationalism that I don't think I've ever seen. I mean, maybe the 1995 referendum. So long way to answer your question. Yes, it's ironic. And that's also a banger of a Canadian song. So somehow we've come full circle with the irony of this moment being cups. And as I said, I'm not convinced that this isn't coming to the news at this time for nefarious might be too strong of a word, but for
opportunistic, shall we say? Opportunistic. I mean, there's a thread of opportunism here. We might lose this iconic Canadian brand, and wouldn't there maybe be a buyer for this large company that represents the country just exactly as the country is looking for recognizable brands?
Doesn't somebody care enough?
That's exactly the pitch that you would make, I imagine, if you're trying to find someone for this moment. Mosha, I'm gonna go with Mosha and then Mark real quick. I'm curious about whether this moment opens up any space for other new Canadian retail. Is that something that we feel hopeful about?
Well, I will just say that the owner, Richard Baker, spent last year $2.7 billion acquiring Neiman Marcus and Bergdorf Goodman. So clearly the funds are available somewhere. And I think trying to sell the Bay is a very difficult proposition in its current state. But in terms of, to be a bit positive here for a second, I want us all to visualize and manifest a space, both physical and digital. Everyone listening here, please, we need to make this happen.
Come on board.
Where you can walk in or click on and experience the most elevated, creative, inspiring assortment of Canadian brands that we can all be really proud of across fashion and beauty and wellness. We've got Triarchy Denim there. We've got Beaufy. We've got Cheekbone Beauty. We've got a ton of Black and Indigenous designers and representing how multicultural Canada is. And where is that place? Where is that space? Why does that not exist? Can Simons or Holt Renfrew carve that out in the meantime, please?
I think that's a very passionate and very beautiful plea, because I think that's exactly what is needed in this moment. Mark, I got maybe 30 seconds left here. Is there any hope for the Bay, you think, as a brand? Oh, I can't hear you. For some reason, you've got a little bit. Oh, there you go. You're back.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
I love what Mosha just described. So let's manifest that. But I also think there are people involved, and we've got jobs that are lost. And back to our Indigenous folks, we shouldn't be thinking about this as holding on to it because it's Canada's oldest company, but we should be thinking about what it could be for the future.
I think that's a perfect place to leave it. I appreciate your time, all of you. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm going to go and think about this a whole bunch. Thanks again.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. Talk to you soon. Mosha Lundström Halbert is a fashion and culture journalist behind the Newsflash TikTok account. Mark Harrison is a founder of the MH3 Collective and Black Talent Initiative. Teri Hart is an entertainment reporter and a regular right here on Commotion. That is it for the show today. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. By the way, you can find us on Instagram. We are at Commotion CBC. I'm not going to be back tomorrow. My pal Radtom Play will be here, but I will see you on Monday.